Airports hum with the promise of new beginnings. For young Liam Reeves, today marked more than just his first solo flight. It was a leap into independence, a memory in the making. Clutching his small backpack with wide-eyed wonder, he didn't know the skies would teach him lessons even grander than adventure. Little Liam was about to cross paths with a bitter reality many still face, the sting of prejudice. But standing quietly behind him was his father, Jonathan Reeves, a man whose life work had been built on respect, integrity, and perseverance. In a world too quick to judge by appearances, this father and son would remind everyone watching that true strength lies not in power or wealth, but in kindness, dignity, and the courage to rise above hatred. The airport buzzed like a living symphony that morning, wheels clattering across polished floors, overhead announcements echoing through vaulted ceilings, and the excited murmur of travelers chasing distant dreams. Amid the flurry of briefcases and boarding passes stood a boy with wishday, wide, hopeful eyes. Liam Reeves, just 11 years old, clutched his backpack close to his chest like a treasured secret. To anyone passing by, he might have seemed like just another young adventurer setting out on a trip. But to Liam, this was so much more. It was the first step into a larger world, a chance to prove to himself and to the man standing proudly by his side that he was ready. Jonathan Reeves watched his son with a soft, knowing smile, the kind of smile worn by fathers who have weathered life's storms and know exactly how precious moments like these are. Dressed in a simple yet commanding suit, Jonathan looked every inch the successful businessman he was. Yet today, he wasn't the owner of a vast airline empire. He was just a dad, his heart swelling with both pride and worry as he prepared to watch his boy take flight alone for the first time. Kneeling to meet Liam eye to eye, Jonathan placed a steady hand on his son's small shoulder. "Remember, son," he said in a voice filled with warmth and gentle authority, "be polite, keep your cool, and if you need anything, the flight attendants are there for you." Liam nodded eagerly, his youthful face alight with excitement. There was courage in that little nod, the kind of courage only innocence can carry so effortlessly. The two shared a brief, heartfelt hug, Jonathan ruffling Liam's hair with a chuckle before sending him off. As Liam made his way toward the gate, he didn't just carry a boarding pass and a backpack. He carried his father's hopes, his family's legacy, and the quiet strength instilled in him from the moment he was born. In the grand rush of the airport, filled with people rushing to meetings, vacations, and new beginnings, no one else noticed the quiet, sacred beauty of that moment. But if you were paying close enough attention, you could feel it. A father letting go, a son stepping forward, and the invisible thread of love, courage, and trust stretching between them, unbreakable even across the wide open skies. Liam stepped onto the plane with a heart full of excitement, greeted warmly by the flight attendants who, sensing his innocence and wonder, treated him with extra kindness. The windows offered a magical view of the busy tarmac below, and as Liam settled into his seat, he could already imagine soaring above the clouds, pressing his nose against the glass like a child in a dream. His small hands carefully opened a book, and he lost himself in the pages, the gentle hum of the engines filling the background. For Liam, this was a new adventure waiting to unfold. But in the midst of this innocent joy, the world revealed its harsher side. Margaret, a woman whose crisp suit and polished demeanor couldn't hide a hardened heart, approached the row. She stopped abruptly when she saw Liam, a young black boy sitting quietly, minding his own business. Her face tightened. In an instant, her expression shifted from indifferent to visibly uncomfortable, her disapproval hanging heavy in the narrow aisle. She double-checked her boarding pass, frowning deeply, as though hoping for a mistake that would rescue her from what she saw as an unbearable situation. Unable to contain her disdain, Margaret flagged down a flight attendant, her voice dripping with entitlement. "There's been a mistake," she said sharply. "I can't sit here." She gestured discreetly, though not discreetly enough, toward Liam, who looked up from his book with polite confusion. The flight attendant, maintaining her professionalism, assured Margaret that her seat was correct and gently explained the flight was fully booked. But Margaret was unmoved. Her voice grew louder, her tone sharper, as she insisted she couldn't sit beside someone like him, offering vague excuses that fooled no one. Passengers nearby began to shift uncomfortably, casting disapproving glances her way, but Margaret remained steadfast in her disdain. Liam, ever the picture of grace taught by a father who had prepared him for moments just like this, remained quiet, his small fingers gripping the edges of his book just a little tighter. His excitement dimmed under the weight of unspoken prejudice. A flight that had promised to be filled with wonder was now shadowed by the cold reality that, even in a sky full of endless possibilities, some hearts remained painfully small. Yet Liam sat tall in his seat, embodying the quiet dignity that no ignorance could diminish, a living reminder that true character isn't defined by who tries to tear you down, but by how you choose to rise. The cabin, once alive with the soft murmur of boarding passengers, grew heavy with an invisible tension. Margaret, still standing in the aisle, refused to let the matter rest. Her face twisted with indignation. She crossed her arms tightly over her chest, making no attempt to hide her displeasure. Liam, sensing the chill that now surrounded him, turned back to his book, his young heart heavy with confusion. He had done nothing wrong except exist in a world that sometimes judged before it ever took the time to know. Margaret's voice, sharp and insistent, sliced through the air. She demanded to speak to someone in charge, her words growing louder, her gestures more exaggerated. The flight attendant, who had shown remarkable patience, remained calm and composed, but the strain was beginning to show in her tired eyes. Around them, fellow passengers shifted uneasily in their seats, exchanging glances filled with disbelief and quiet disapproval. Still, Margaret pressed on. She grumbled about service standards and passenger rights, painting herself as the victim while ignoring the small boy sitting silently by the window, his spirits slowly dimming under the weight of her disdain. Her assumptions about Liam were not whispered prejudices. They were loud public declarations, voiced as if she were entitled to more, entitled to better, simply because of who she believed herself to be. Liam sat perfectly still, holding on to his father's words like a lifeline. Stay calm, stay kind. Never let someone else's cruelty change who you are. His small fingers traced the edges of the book resting on his lap, his gaze fixed firmly out the window, as if the world beyond the glass offered him a refuge the cabin no longer could. Passengers nearby began murmuring among themselves. A few shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered words of encouragement toward Liam that he couldn't quite hear but somehow felt. The tide of the cabin's mood was turning, though Margaret, wrapped tightly in her own sense of righteousness, failed to notice. Margaret thought she was making a point about comfort and preference. Instead, she was making a statement about her own narrowness of heart, one witnessed by every man, woman, and child seated near her. In that small aluminum tube hurtling toward the sky, humanity was on full display. In Margaret's coldness, yes, but more beautifully, in a young boy's quiet, unbreakable grace. High above the polished floors of the terminal, in the quiet luxury of first class, Jonathan Reeves was reviewing documents on his tablet, unaware that turbulence had already begun, not in the skies but right behind him. When the lead flight attendant approached, her face troubled, Jonathan looked up, immediately alert. Her voice was low, respectful, but the words she spoke cut sharply through his calm. Liam was in trouble. Jonathan set down his tablet with a quiet finality, his jaw tightening in a way that only a father's deep, protective love could summon. He rose without a word, smoothing the front of his suit as he stood. The air shifted around him. Even in first class, among the powerful and the privileged, Jonathan's presence commanded attention, not because of the wealth he carried, but because of the unshakable dignity he wore like a second skin. He made his way through the cabin, each step deliberate, purposeful. Behind him, his discreet bodyguard followed, a silent witness to what was unfolding. As Jonathan moved closer to the economy section, passengers turned in their seats, their chatter dying into curious whispers. Even those who didn't recognize him could feel the change in the air. A reckoning was coming. In row 23, Margaret, still stewing in her own entitlement, had no idea what was approaching. She continued to mutter complaints under her breath, her arms crossed in defiance. Liam sat quietly beside her, doing exactly what his father had taught him, holding on to his dignity even when the world tried to take it away. Jonathan's tall frame finally reached them. He bent low, his hand resting gently on Liam's shoulder, a simple gesture of reassurance that said, "You are not alone." Liam looked up, his face brightening instantly, the tightness in his small body easing. Margaret glanced up too, expecting perhaps another flight attendant to placate her complaints. But when she met Jonathan's gaze, steady and piercing, something in her faltered. She straightened in her seat, smoothing her skirt with nervous fingers, not yet realizing that the man standing before her was no ordinary passenger. In that moment, the balance of power quietly shifted, not through anger, not through spectacle, but through the quiet, immovable presence of a father standing for his son. Margaret's lips curled into a thin, impatient line as she glanced at Jonathan, assuming he was just another airline employee sent to appease her complaints. She straightened her shoulders and waved her boarding pass in the air like a flag of authority. "Oh, good," she said, her voice thick with condescension. "You must be here to fix this. I need another seat immediately. This situation is completely unacceptable." Jonathan studied her for a brief moment, his face calm, his eyes steady. Around them, the entire cabin seemed to lean in, the hum of the aircraft fading into a thick, expectant silence. Without raising his voice, Jonathan answered, each word deliberate and clear. "I am with the airline," he said smoothly, "but not in the way you think." Margaret blinked, confusion flickering across her face. She opened her mouth to argue, but Jonathan continued, his voice cutting through the tension like a bell. "I'm Jonathan Reeves," he said, "the owner of this airline." The words seemed to hang in the air, heavy and undeniable. Passengers gasped quietly. Some exchanged wide-eyed glances. Others allowed small smiles of satisfaction to break across their faces. Margaret's hand, still clutching her boarding pass, dropped slowly into her lap. "And this young man you've been complaining about," Jonathan continued, turning his gaze toward Liam with a warmth that softened his features, "is my son." A flush of color rushed into Margaret's cheeks. But before she could summon a defense, a woman across the aisle spoke up, her voice firm. "She judged him the moment she saw him," the woman said, nodding toward Liam. "That boy's been nothing but polite." Another passenger chimed in, his voice steady. "It's her making the scene, not him." Margaret shrank under the weight of their words, her earlier bravado crumbling into embarrassed silence. She fumbled for an explanation, something, anything, to excuse her behavior. I didn't know," she stammered weakly. "He didn't say anything about who he was." Jonathan's expression didn't waver. "And why should he have to?" he asked, his voice low but strong. "Respect isn't something you offer based on a person's title or status. It's something every human being deserves, no matter who they are or what they look like." The cabin was silent, passengers holding their breath as Jonathan's words settled like stones in the heart. In that quiet, unshakable truth, Margaret and everyone listening felt the weight of what respect truly meant. Jonathan stood tall in the narrow aisle, his presence alone commanding a respect that Margaret's words never could. The silence that followed his statement wasn't empty. It was filled with the heavy realization that something bigger than a seat dispute had just taken place. It was about dignity. It was about humanity. He turned, addressing not just Margaret, but the entire cabin. His voice was steady, unwavering, like a father gently but firmly correcting a wayward child. "What happened here today," he said, his eyes sweeping across the passengers, "is not just about my son. It's about how we choose to see one another. It's about whether we allow assumptions and fear to guide us, or whether we rise higher, into kindness, into respect." The words moved through the cabin like a current, touching hearts that perhaps hadn't realized they were hungry for such truth. Some passengers nodded silently, others shifted in their seats, the weight of the moment pressing gently upon them. Margaret sat stiffly, her face flushed with shame, her earlier arrogance now stripped away by the honesty she could no longer dodge. She opened her mouth to speak, to justify, to explain, but Jonathan raised his hand softly, stopping her without anger, without ridicule. "No," he said gently, "there are no excuses for judging a child by the color of his skin, not here. Not anywhere." Across the aisle, a woman wiped a tear from the corner of her eye. An older gentleman, perhaps a grandfather himself, gave a solemn nod, his gaze resting proudly on Liam. And then, breaking the heavy stillness, Liam himself spoke. His voice was small but clear, a voice that carried the kind of grace it takes some people a lifetime to find. "I didn't mean to cause any trouble," he said, looking at Margaret, then around at the passengers. "I just wanted to have a nice flight." His innocence, his strength, laid bare before them, shattered whatever walls remained. The cabin seemed to exhale as passengers murmured their support. Soft claps, kind smiles, a wave of warmth that wrapped itself around Liam like a shield. In that high place above the clouds, humanity had stumbled, but it had also found a way to stand again. And it was a child who led the way. Margaret sat frozen in her seat, her once defiant posture now softened by shame. Her shoulders, once held high with indignation, began to sag under the weight of the truth. Around her, she no longer felt admiration or agreement, only quiet judgment and unspoken disappointment. It wasn't the kind of silence that offers comfort. It was the kind that lingers, echoing louder than words. She glanced at the faces nearby, passengers who had witnessed her fall from certainty to discomfort, from superiority to scrutiny. No one spoke directly to her anymore. They didn't need to. Their expressions said enough. Averted eyes, tight-lipped glances, a slow, collective turning away. Margaret, for the first time, felt what it meant to be on the receiving end of judgment. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for her water, hoping to hide the redness creeping up her neck. She stared down at the tray table as if it might offer her a way out of this moment. But there was no exit, no quick escape from the reality she had helped create. Even her apology, mumbled, barely audible, felt too late, too small. "I'm sorry," she had whispered, not out of true contrition, but desperation. And yet Liam, with the grace that seemed far beyond his years, had accepted it, simply, quietly, with more dignity than most adults could muster. Margaret wasn't used to feeling small, but in that moment, she did. Not because anyone had humiliated her, but because she had revealed the smallest part of herself, and everyone had seen it. Not her wealth, not her education, not her style, but the narrowness of her heart. The flight continued, but for Margaret, the journey had changed. Her window no longer offered a view of freedom, but a mirror reflecting her own flaws back at her. For the first time in a long time, she began to wonder, not how others had failed her, but how she had failed herself. Because sometimes the most uncomfortable truths don't come from confrontation. They come from within, quiet, humbling, and impossible to ignore. As the plane cut steadily through the clouds, the tension that once gripped the cabin began to ease, replaced by a gentler, more reflective hush. Passengers stole glances at Liam, no longer with pity, but with admiration. The small boy, who had endured so much in the space of a few short hours, sat calmly by the window, his eyes fixed on the endless blue horizon beyond the glass. Around him, small acts of kindness bloomed quietly. A woman across the aisle leaned over, offering him a small bag of pretzels with a warm smile. An older man 2 rows back gave him a subtle thumbs up, the kind of silent encouragement that speaks louder than words. Another passenger passed a folded note to the flight attendant, who delivered it discreetly to Liam. In careful handwriting, it read, "Never stop being who you are. The world needs more people like you." Liam tucked the note into the pocket of his backpack, a shy smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The sting of Margaret's earlier disdain was still there, a bruise not easily forgotten, but it no longer defined the moment. Instead, the kindness of strangers, the simple, quiet gestures, wrapped around him like a warm blanket against the coldness he had faced. Margaret, in contrast, remained rooted in her seat, her gaze fixed firmly on her hands. She avoided the eyes of the passengers she had once demanded attention from. For her, the flight could not end soon enough. When the plane finally touched down and the wheels kissed the earth with the screech, there was a collective breath, as if the entire cabin had completed a journey much greater than miles alone could measure. Margaret was among the first to unbuckle her seatbelt and gather her things, her head bowed low. As she moved hurriedly down the aisle, passengers parted wordlessly, allowing her to pass, but not without the quiet weight of their judgment following her. Liam stayed seated, feeling the steady hand of his father on his shoulder, grounding him, reminding him who he was. Jonathan's eyes held pride, not just for surviving the ordeal, but for the grace Liam had shown through it. Sometimes the greatest victories are not loud or triumphant. Sometimes they are quiet and steady and wrapped in dignity. Margaret sat alone in a quiet corner of the airport, her suitcase tucked neatly beside her, her phone resting forgotten in her lap. Around her, life bustled on, families reunited with hugs and laughter, business travelers rushing past with purpose, but Margaret seemed suspended in a world apart, trapped within the echo of her own actions. She stared blankly at the airport's bustling heart, the distant sound of a child's laughter cutting through her reverie like a soft but stinging reminder. Margaret's mind replayed the events of the flight over and over, each memory more uncomfortable than the last. The look in Liam's eyes, not anger, not defiance, but simple, unguarded confusion, haunted her. The quiet strength of Jonathan's voice, the passengers' disapproving stares, her own words now sounding cruel and hollow to her own ears. For years, Margaret had wrapped herself in justifications, caution, comfort, preference. But for the first time, those defenses rang empty. It wasn't caution that made her behave that way. It was fear. It was judgment. And it had been so easy, too easy to hide behind excuses. She sighed deeply, the sound of it carrying a weight she hadn't known she was holding. Her gaze dropped to her phone, still open to the airline's app. Without fully thinking, her fingers moved, searching, hesitating, until she found the Contact Us section. Her heart pounded as she typed, deleting and retyping, searching for the right words, words she had never imagined she would need. "Dear Mr. Reeves," she finally wrote, "I want to apologize for my behavior. There is no excuse for how I acted. Your son showed more grace and strength than I deserved. Thank you for teaching me a lesson I didn't even know I needed." Margaret stared at the message for a long time before pressing send, a single tear sliding down her cheek. She didn't expect forgiveness, but she knew that growth had to start somewhere, and sometimes the hardest journeys are the ones within. Somewhere across the terminal, a mother lifted her child into her arms, spinning her around in a circle of laughter. Margaret watched them, something warm and aching stirring in her chest. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe a heart, no matter how hardened by fear or habit, could still learn to open again. 2 weeks later, in a sunlit hall filled with rows of folding chairs and the hopeful buzz of conversation, Jonathan and Liam stood before a small crowd. The event, hosted by the airline, was called Empathy in Action, a gathering meant to remind people that the skies weren't just a place of travel, but a space where respect and understanding could take flight, too. Jonathan spoke first, his voice even, warm, carrying the weight of a man who had built not just a business, but a legacy rooted in values. He didn't talk about success in dollars or accolades. Instead, he spoke about the currency of kindness, the importance of seeing every person, regardless of their background, as worthy of dignity. His words wove a tapestry of hope across the room, drawing nods and even a few tears from those listening. Then came Liam, standing behind the microphone with a poise rare for his age. His voice, clear but tender, carried across the hall. "Sometimes," Liam said, "it's hard to stand up for yourself. But if you don't, who will? We all deserve to be treated with respect, no matter what we look like." The applause that followed wasn't polite, it was heartfelt. A standing ovation for a boy who, in his quiet strength, had become a beacon for something bigger than himself. And across the city, sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold beside her, Margaret listened to a live stream of the event. She heard Liam's words, felt the earnestness in his small but mighty voice, and realized how far she had yet to go, and how deeply she wanted to change. It wasn't instant, it wasn't easy, but Margaret began to show up. She started volunteering at local community centers, sharing her own story, not to erase the harm she had caused, but to offer a warning, a mirror, and most of all, a hand of understanding. She learned that change isn't about erasing the past. It's about acknowledging it, learning from it, and doing better every single day. For Liam, the experience became a cornerstone of who he was becoming. A young man defined not by what he endured, but by how he rose above it. And for Jonathan, it was a reminder that sometimes the greatest legacies aren't measured in buildings or businesses, but in the hearts we inspire to be better. For Liam, the events of that flight did more than leave a memory. They carved a path. What had started as an ordinary journey had transformed into a quiet awakening, a lesson in the kind of courage that doesn't shout or demand attention, but stands steady and strong when it matters most. Back at school, Liam poured himself into a new project, one close to his heart, a presentation on kindness and respect. Armed with the note a kind passenger had slipped him on the plane. "Never stop being who you are. The world needs more people like you." Liam stood in front of his classmates, his voice steady and sure. He spoke not of anger, but of hope, not of blame, but of the power each person holds to make a difference by simply choosing kindness over judgment. His teachers watched with quiet pride as Liam, still so young, taught lessons many adults struggled to master. His classmates, too, listened differently. The message was simple, but its truth resonated. Treat others with dignity, not because of who they are, but because of who you are. At home, Jonathan watched his son's growth with a pride that words couldn't fully capture. The experience hadn't made Liam bitter or hardened. It had made him stronger, more compassionate, and deeply rooted in a sense of who he was and who he wanted to be. Inspired by Liam's grace, Jonathan expanded a mentoring program at the airline, pairing seasoned employees with young professionals from diverse backgrounds. His vision was clear: an airline in a world where respect was the standard, not the exception. Father and son often talked about that day, not with sadness, but with a sense of purpose. It became their touchstone, a reminder that even in moments of unfairness, we always have a choice: to meet ignorance with dignity, to answer prejudice with grace, and to never let someone else's fear diminish our light. Because in the end, it wasn't just a flight that changed Liam. It was the power of holding on to kindness when it would have been easier to let go. And that kind of strength, the quiet, unwavering kind, is what true greatness is built upon. This wasn't just the story of a flight delayed by human failure or pride. It was the story of courage, accountability, and the profound power of change. It was about a young boy who chose dignity over anger, a father who led not with power but with principle, and even a woman who, despite her faults, found the humility to seek a better path forward. Liam's quiet grace reminded everyone that strength isn't found in how loudly we defend ourselves, but in how steadfastly we hold to our values when the world tests them. Jonathan's leadership taught that true power isn't measured by titles or wealth, but by the courage to stand up for what's right when no one's watching. And even Margaret's faltering steps toward redemption showed that while we cannot erase our mistakes, we can choose to grow beyond them. The lesson was simple, yet timeless. Kindness matters. Respect matters. And perhaps most of all, the willingness to see beyond our own assumptions and reach for our better selves is what ultimately defines us. As Jonathan often said to Liam, anyone can take the easy road of judgment and fear, but the real journey, the one that makes life worth living, is the one where we choose to build bridges, not walls. That day in the sky became more than a painful memory. It became a beacon, a call to rise above prejudice, to answer cruelty with compassion, and to remember that every small act of courage ripples outward in ways we may never fully see. Because no matter how divided the world may seem at times, it's in these small, powerful moments, when one heart softens, when one hand reaches out, that real change begins. And so Liam's story isn't just his alone. It belongs to all of us. It's a reminder that we are never too small, too young, or too late to make a difference. All it takes is a willingness to stand tall, to speak gently, and to choose kindness, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard. Long after the wheels touched down and the passengers went their separate ways, the memory of that flight lingered, not just in the minds of those who witnessed it, but in the quiet spaces of their hearts. It stayed with them through mundane moments, while brewing coffee in the morning, while waiting at a stoplight, while tucking grandchildren into bed. Because true stories, the ones that matter, do more than entertain. They leave a mark. They remind us of who we are and who we still have the power to become. For some passengers, the flight was a gentle wake-up call, a reminder that kindness is not an extra we offer when convenient, but a duty we owe to each soul we encounter. For others, it was a stirring of courage, an invitation to step up the next time injustice tried to pass by unnoticed. And for Margaret, it became a mirror she could no longer turn away from. One moment, one poor choice had peeled back years of assumptions she had never thought to question. But facing herself honestly for the first time offered her something unexpected. Not shame, but hope. Hope that it's never too late to be better. For Liam, the day did not define him. It refined him. It became the moment he realized that true power lies not in forcing change with anger, but in inspiring it through grace. He learned that sometimes the most powerful voice in the room is not the loudest, but the one that speaks with quiet dignity, refusing to meet hatred with hatred. And for Jonathan, it was a quiet affirmation that the seeds we plant in our children's hearts, seeds of integrity, courage, and compassion, can take root and flourish even when the winds of the world try to tear them away. In a world that sometimes feels so divided, stories like this remind us that real change doesn't come from grand speeches or sweeping declarations. It begins in small, brave choices: a father standing up, a child holding firm, a stranger offering a hand instead of turning away. Because in the end, the most important journey isn't the one that carries us across miles. It's the one that carries us closer to the best version of ourselves. In the end, it wasn't just about a flight, a seat, or even a single act of injustice. It was about the quiet, enduring power of kindness. It was about the courage to stand firm in dignity when the world tries to shake you. And it was about the reminder that no matter how much noise anger can make, grace will always speak louder. When we choose compassion over judgment, courage over silence, we do more than change a moment. We change the world, one heart at a time.